The air was thick with the suffocating scent of jasmine and expensive, roasting leg of lamb as Amelia stepped onto the marble porch of the Harrington estate. Beside her, 8-year-old Clara gripped her hand, her small knuckles white. Clara's vitiligo, patches of pale, unpigmented skin blooming across her cheeks and hands like strange white lace, was suddenly a magnet for the harsh golden light spilling from the foyer. Amelia felt the familiar, paralyzing rush of adrenaline, knowing this battle was lost before the first word was spoken. She had a choice to make, right here, right now. Turn around and protect the fragile confidence she'd spent months building in Clara, or walk through those mahogany doors and risk her father's wrath, the wrath that controlled the trust fund she desperately needed to afford Clara's specialized school. Amelia's fatal flaw was not weakness, but a chronic, crippling fear of disapproval. It was a generational poison, passed down from her own mother, manifested in her inability to sever the financial cord that bound her to Robert Harrington's cold, tyrannical orbit. Tonight, that fear was amplified 1,000-fold. The clock was ticking. She had precisely 72 hours. Until the annual family meeting where Robert would formalize the distribution of funds that were currently the only barrier between Clara and academic failure. The moment the polished brass knocker sounded against the heavy wood, the illusion of safety shattered. Robert, perfectly tailored and impossibly stern, opened the door himself, his gaze sliding past Amelia instantly, fixing on Clara. His nostrils flared slightly as though catching a faint, unpleasant odor. "Amelia," he stated, his voice a low, gravelly monotone that carried the weight of 1,000 dismissals. Clara lifted her hand in a shy, hopeful wave, exposing the most prominent white patch on her wrist. Robert's lips curled, not into a smile, but into a sneer of pure, surgical cruelty. "You ruined our perfect evening by bringing that—" The silence that followed was heavier than the crystal chandelier hovering above them. Clara's small hand involuntarily tightened its grip, her breath catching in a faint, involuntary hiccup. Amelia's jaw locked, the automatic, terrifying reflex of her fear of disapproval kicked in, overriding the primal urge to pull Clara away and scream at her father. Instead of defending her daughter, she managed a weak, frantic smile directed at Robert, the architect of this pain. "Dad, don't be like that. She's fine. It's a standard genetic variation. She's dressed beautifully." Robert Harrington, a pillar of corporate finance in the USA's brutal northeastern landscape, merely raised a sculpted eyebrow. He did not move aside. "I expected professionalism, Amelia. This is the annual family gathering, not a pity party. We have guests important to the firm's legacy. Your presence alone is usually marginal enough. This spectacle is unacceptable." He gestured vaguely toward Clara's face, dismissing her existence with the flick of a diamond-studded cufflink. Amelia could smell the bitter, clean scent of his starched collar mingling with the overwhelming perfume of the jasmine bush clinging to the entryway trellis. It was always about the image, wasn't it? Every action, every word, calibrated for external approval, leaving nothing real or nurturing inside the house. The minor problem created by Amelia's flaw wasn't Robert's cruelty, that was guaranteed, but her visible, public inability to counter it. She stood frozen, a deer in the headlights of his disapproval, teaching Clara, by terrible example, that her father's opinion outweighed her self-worth. Clara's eyes, normally bright and questioning, were now wide and shiny with unshed tears, fixed on Amelia, silently begging for rescue that Amelia could not yet offer. 71 hours and 50 minutes left. The internal clock shrieked, "And you are already failing her." The polished marble floor beneath Amelia's thin dress shoes felt cold and impossibly slippery, threatening to throw her into the chasm of his contempt. The tension finally broke when Grandmother Eleanor, a woman whose face was a map of old battles and silent regrets, emerged from the living room, her gait surprisingly steady. She saw the tableau, Robert blocking the entrance, Amelia paralyzed by her fear of disapproval, and Clara wilting under the oppressive scrutiny. "Robert, for heaven's sake, let them in. The souffle is burning, and Senator Davis is asking for the Harringtons' legendary hospitality." Eleanor's voice was dry, the sound of brittle leaves skittering across pavement. Robert stepped aside grudgingly, but not before delivering a final, low-voiced strike aimed solely at Amelia. "Control your daughter, or control yourself enough to leave. The funds are contingent on demonstrating maturity, not drama." Amelia swallowed the metallic taste of humiliation. She guided Clara quickly across the entrance hall, the sound of their soft steps swallowed by the vast, echoing space. The house always demanded silence, demanding that personal pain be buried beneath the heavy Persian rugs. The family dinner was already underway in the formal dining room, a long, suffocating expanse dominated by a mahogany table set for 20. Obstacle 1. The seating arrangement. Robert had deliberately placed Clara, and thus Amelia, at the absolute furthest end of the table, next to the rarely used service door, placing them symbolically outside the inner circle. This was the practical challenge: how to participate and demonstrate maturity and competence when physically marginalized and emotionally targeted. Amelia's hands trembled, a slight vibration against the cold, starched linen napkin, as she tried to force a natural smile for Clara. The conversation, a predictable torrent of financial projections and political maneuvers across the USAOS, washed over them. Clara tried to engage, pointing out a small silver elephant figurine on the centerpiece. "Mommy, look at its trunk. It's like a happy sneeze," she whispered, clearly desperate for normalcy. Amelia, hyper-aware of her father's looming shadow at the head of the table, shushed her gently, tightening her grip on Clara's hand under the table, demonstrating her flaw, choosing silence and invisibility over her daughter's joyful curiosity to avoid a public confrontation that might jeopardize the next 71 hours, and the critical trust meeting. The air smelled strongly of heavy furniture polish and the dense, fatty richness of the lamb. The subtle pressure of her father's expectations became almost physical, a weight bearing down on the cheap silverware near the service door. Amelia's cousin, Julian, Robert's golden heir apparent, noticed the deliberate exclusion. Julian, who had always shown a quiet, uncomfortable kindness toward Amelia and Clara, shifted awkwardly in his executive chair. He was the only person at the table not currently thriving in the high-stakes corporate environment of the USA. He attempted to bridge the gap, raising his voice slightly. "Amelia, I heard Clara won that district reading competition. That's remarkable." The sudden spotlight felt scorching. Amelia flinched internally, her fear of disapproval. Immediately interpreting Julian's kindness as a challenge to Robert's authority, she responded too quickly, too dismissively. "Oh, it was nothing, Julian. Just a local school thing. Nothing major." She offered a strained, forced laugh, trying desperately to minimize Clara's achievement to avoid drawing Robert's critical eye. Clara slumped slightly, the joy in her expression dissolving like sugar in hot tea. She looked down at her lap, running a thumb over the texture of the rough linen napkin. The sound of the clinking ice in Robert's crystal tumbler was the loudest noise in the room. The need to shrink herself, to make her achievements, and her daughter's life, smaller, was Amelia's primary method of survival in this house. This self-diminishment became the subplot. As the dinner progressed, Amelia noticed the quiet intensity with which Clara was observing the adults, particularly her grandfather. Clara, realizing the effect her visible difference had on Robert, was starting to internalize the mandate of invisibility. When the waiter offered dessert, Clara shook her head quickly, avoiding eye contact, despite Amelia knowing how much she adored the lemon tarts. "Are you sure, honey?" Amelia whispered, trying to project warmth without noise. Clara just gripped the edge of the table. "My stomach hurts, Mommy." The texture of the cold marble of the estate felt oppressive, a physical representation of the rigidity of the Harrington legacy. Amelia knew it wasn't her stomach. It was the poison seeping in. Only Saki, 70 hours. Until the meeting, and already Clara was paying the emotional price for Amelia's hesitation. The dinner was nearing its chaotic conclusion, a flurry of brandy and self-congratulation, when Obstacle 2 hit. Robert Harrington rose, tapping a silver spoon against his wine glass, demanding attention. The clink was sharp, silencing the room instantly. "Before we conclude this evening of success," he announced, his gaze sweeping the room before landing heavily on Amelia, "I have an announcement regarding the future financial structure. It involves demonstrating family loyalty." This was the moral dilemma. Robert proposed a temporary change to the trust, effective immediately, that would require all beneficiaries, Amelia and Julian, to sign a document agreeing to relocate their primary residence within a 2-mile radius of the estate in the USA's affluent Greenwich corridor, ensuring constant, immediate family proximity and oversight. "This will guarantee unity and focus," Robert stated, sliding 2 documents down the vast table. Amelia's heart pounded against her ribs. She was currently living in a smaller, quieter town where Clara had found a specialized, supportive school environment, the very environment the trust money was supposed to secure. Moving would mean pulling Clara out of that school instantly, sacrificing her academic well-being for the certainty of the trust funds. It was a cruel public sacrifice. The family loyalty Robert demanded was always conditional, always requiring the surrender of personal autonomy. Julian, to everyone's shock, immediately picked up his pen and signed his document, flashing Robert a dutiful, slightly strained smile. Amelia reached for the cold, smooth parchment. If she signed, Clara would lose her stability, but Amelia would secure the funds needed for future treatments and the general stability the Harrington name guaranteed. If she refused, Robert would undoubtedly cut her off entirely during the meeting in the next 69 hours, guaranteeing poverty and a massive setback. Her bare fear of disapproval screamed at her to sign, to comply, to make the visible choice of loyalty. Then came the reversion. 1. As Amelia brought the pen tip close to the paper, Clara's small, quiet voice cut through the heavy silence. "Grandpa, why is my skin bad?" Robert froze, his face losing its mask of composure. He didn't answer. He simply glared at Amelia. And in that moment, Amelia realized the truth. The trust fund was never about money. It was about control. Robert didn't care if she moved close. He just cared that she obeyed. If she signed, she wasn't securing money. She was confirming her fear. The room seemed to inhale sharply at Clara's question. Robert's face was the color of old mahogany, his controlled composure fractured by the audacity of a child daring to mention something aesthetically imperfect in his perfect world. Amelia felt a powerful shift inside her chest. Clara's innocent, direct question, born from the pain of the last hour, had stripped away the financial veneer of the dilemma. The consequence of reversion 1, the realization that obedience was the true currency, was immediate. If Amelia signed, she would be sacrificing Clara's dignity to satisfy her own fear of disapproval. The weight of the pen in her hand suddenly felt like a weapon aimed at her daughter. She didn't sign. She placed the pen back on the table. "Dad," Amelia said, her voice surprisingly steady, though the fine hair on her arm stood on end. "Clara's school is 3 hours away. That distance is non-negotiable for her health and education." Robert's eyes narrowed into slivers of ice. "Then the trust is non-negotiable for you, Amelia. You have tried 68 hours once to reconsider your priorities before the formal distribution." He pushed the documents away with a decisive, contemptuous swipe of his hand, signaling the immediate halt of her access to even the minor emergency provisions she relied on. He had always viewed her as disposable, easily cut off the moment she ceased to be pliable. Clara, observing this exchange, looked relieved, but also immensely frightened by the sudden, palpable danger. The air now smelled of expensive liquor and scorched opportunity. Amelia stood up, gathering the linen napkin she had twisted into a tight, damp rope. She felt the scrutiny of 20 powerful people focused on her, the outcast, the failure. She had made a choice, but it was a choice that meant immediate, grinding financial panic in the high-cost economy of the USA. "We're leaving now," Amelia announced, her throat dry. She reached for Clara, whose small hand felt clammy against her own. They had won the battle of integrity, but lost the war of survival, all because Amelia had waited too long, paralyzed by her fear, to simply say no from the start. Driving away from the estate, the oppressive scent of jasmine was replaced by the stale, familiar smell of old leather in her economy car. Amelia gripped the steering wheel so tightly her fingers ached. She had achieved a moment of genuine self-respect by refusing the contract, but her fear of disapproval had ensured that moment came with maximum consequence. She should have stood up to him months ago, not waited until she was pinned against the wall. Clara, silent in the passenger seat, finally spoke. "Mommy, are we poor now?" That question, so blunt, felt like a physical strike. "No, sweetie," Amelia lied weakly, the immediate financial crunch already pressing down on her. The specialized school tuition was due in 3 weeks. Robert's decision meant zero liquidity, zero access to the considerable emergency funds he had dangled before her. The inheritance wasn't just money. It was the entire infrastructure of the life Robert believed she should lead. Amelia realized she had to secure the funds herself, or Clara's progress would be erased. She drove straight to the cramped, shared office space she rented downtown. She was a skilled financial analyst, but her career had always been secondary, hobbled by her need to remain available for her father's capricious demands, the very demand born of her flaw. Now she had to ramp up a practice she'd deliberately kept small, in a hyper-competitive sector of the USAA. The first step of growth was immediate action. She logged into her old professional network, her fingers flying across the cold plastic keys of the outdated laptop. She reached out to former colleagues offering consulting services at an aggressively low rate, working through the night. The sound of the cheap fluorescent light humming overhead filled the sterile space. 64 hours to the meeting. She worked with a frantic intensity, trying to superimpose productivity over panic, pushing the physical limits to make up for the psychological limitations her father had imposed. She was growing, finally acting independently, but the pressure was immense, and her contacts were guarded, knowing her connection to the powerful Robert Harrington. The next 2 days blurred into an exhausting cycle of frantic phone calls and rejected proposals. Amelia secured 2 small, inadequate consulting gigs, but the money wouldn't even cover half of Clara's tuition. Her biggest hope lay with a former client, Mr. Henderson, whose massive acquisition deal was currently stalled. If she could fix the analysis, she could demand a significant fee. Obstacle 3. The crisis. As the deadline, now only 24 hours away, loomed, Robert Harrington made his final, most devastating move, utilizing Amelia's previous compliant behavior against her. Amelia received a certified letter delivered by a private courier. It was a cease and desist order. Robert, using his extensive legal influence, had asserted that Amelia's use of certain proprietary financial models she developed while consulting for his firm years ago, under the explicit condition of exclusivity, was a breach of contract. The letter was designed not to win in court, but to immediately freeze her ability to work in the sector. He hadn't just cut off the supply. He had tainted the well. This was the loss caused directly by her fear of disapproval. Years ago, when Robert forced her to sign that proprietary agreement, she signed without reading, eager to secure his temporary approval, believing the agreement was simply a formality required for her in-house status. Now that same document was strangling her professional life in the USA. The letter named her current clients, demanding that she immediately sever ties. She couldn't touch Henderson's deal. She couldn't make any money. She threw the letter onto the steel surface of her desk. The cold metal echoed the sudden, sinking feeling in her stomach. She looked across the small apartment living room at Clara, peacefully coloring, oblivious to the fact that her future had just been professionally obliterated by her grandfather. The air in the small apartment suddenly felt thin, smelling faintly of stale coffee and desperation. The sound of the paper sliding across the desk was the sound of her last hope crumbling. Amelia sunk into the cheap armchair, staring blankly at the wall. The crisis was total. No income, no prospect of immediate work due to the legal threat, and the trust meeting set for the next day. This was her night dark of the soul, the moment where the weight of her lifelong fear of disapproval became unbearable. She had spent 30 years prioritizing Robert's acceptance, and that compliance had now guaranteed her daughter's downfall. She lifted the certified letter again, running her finger over the raised seal of the Harrington legal team. The proprietary agreement she had signed years ago was airtight, legally devastating in the competitive financial environment of the USA. There was no wiggle room. "Mommy, are you playing with that paper?" Clara asked, peering over her coloring book. Amelia looked at the vibrant, messy colors Clara used, a wild abandon Amelia had never dared to possess. She saw the pale patches on Clara's cheeks, a visible difference Clara wore without shame, simply as a part of her existence. Clara didn't try to hide it. She asked about it, accepted it, and moved on. The irony was a bitter swallow. Her 8-year-old possessed more courage than she did. The difference between them was stark. Clara sought knowledge. Amelia sought invisibility. Amelia closed her eyes, letting the full force of the failure wash over her. It wasn't just the money. It was the years of subtle damage she had inflicted on herself, and now, inadvertently, on Clara. By allowing Robert to define her worth, the change was not external. It had to be internal. She had to finally, permanently, reject the premise of his authority. She realized with a rush of cold clarity that the trust meeting wasn't a negotiation. It was the final stage of the ritual humiliation he planned to use to solidify Julian's position. If she went to that meeting seeking the money, she was already kneeling. The morning of the trust meeting arrived, the countdown clock at its final hour. Instead of dressing in the muted, conservative clothes Robert favored, Amelia chose a sharp, vibrant blue suit, a small but meaningful act of defiance. She did not drive to the Harrington estate. Instead, she drove to the downtown office of Julian, her cousin. Julian looked genuinely surprised when Amelia walked in, her face set with a new, almost frightening resolve. His office was a testament to Robert's success. Sleek glass, polished wood, overlooking the concrete canyons of the USA's financial heart. "Amelia, shouldn't you be at Dad's office? The meeting starts in 45 minutes. Julian's fingers drummed nervously on his oak desk. "I'm not going to that meeting, Julian. Not to beg," Amelia stated. She slammed the cease and desist letter on his desk. The texture of the embossed legal paper was stiff, unyielding. Robert froze me out of the market. He used the proprietary agreement I signed years ago. She looked Julian straight in the eye, dropping the weight of her fear of disapproval. I need you to tell me why you signed that residency agreement so fast. You hate Greenwich. You hate the social circuit. Julian's composure crumbled. He leaned back, running a hand through his perfectly groomed hair. The sound of a distant police siren filtered faintly through the triple-pane glass. I signed it because it's irrelevant, Amelia. I'm quitting the firm. I'm leaving the trust structure entirely. I've already accepted an academic position in California. I needed Robert to believe I was compliant for 2 more days until I could finalize the exit package. Julian had played the dutiful son to buy himself freedom, a strategy Amelia had been too afraid to consider. Amelia stared. You're walking away from the Harrington legacy? It was killing me, Amelia, just like it's killing you. But I can tell you something about that proprietary model Robert claims you stole. Julian lowered his voice. He didn't just restrict your use, he restricted everyone's. He has a history of using boilerplate contracts to ensure no one can truly compete outside his umbrella. And the proprietary agreement you signed wasn't for internal use. It was a general non-compete. He just never enforced it until now. The realization crystallized in Amelia's mind. Julian was free because he decided to be. The legal threat was real, but Robert's goal was not to win a lawsuit. It was to use the threat of litigation to ensure her permanent obedience. With only 23 minutes remaining until the trust meeting, Amelia knew she had one chance to dismantle his control. It wasn't about the money anymore. It was about severing the psychological tether. Julian, you said he restricted everyone's use of that model. Does that include the proprietary data models he used for the Senator Davis acquisition last year? Julian frowned, adjusting his tie. Yes. I remember signing a similar document before analyzing that portfolio. Why? Because if he used those models in a public deal without disclosing the non-compete clause, or if he misclassified the proprietary nature of the data to an external client, that's not just a breach of contract with me. That's fraud, Amelia said, a cold, hard excitement pulsing in her veins. She pulled out her laptop, the keyboard's plastic texture feeling suddenly rough under her aggressive typing. Robert's meticulous desire for control had finally created a structural weakness in his fortress. She accessed her old firm emails, the ones Robert believed she had deleted. She found the email chain detailing the Davis deal's structure. Julian leaned over her shoulder, the scent of his expensive cologne mixing with the dry, slightly dusty smell of the office air conditioning. The only sound was the rapid clicking of keys. Amelia found what she needed. Robert had explicitly stated in a legal brief to the USA Securities and Exchange Commission that the data models used for the Davis acquisition were standard, commercially available analytical tools, directly contradicting the proprietary agreement she and Julian had signed. That was reversion 2. The revelation was not that Robert was cruel, that was known, but that he was publicly and legally vulnerable. She took a screenshot of the damning email and printed it. The printer whirred loudly, spitting out the physical evidence of his hypocrisy. He used my forced compliance against me. Now I use his hypocrisy against him. Amelia arrived at the Harrington estate precisely as the clock hit 0. The trust meeting was beginning. She walked past the flustered receptionist, ignoring the frantic calls, and marched into the mahogany-paneled conference room. Robert, flanked by his lawyers and the rest of the board, looked infuriated by the disruption, his face a thundercloud of absolute power. Amelia, you are late and irrelevant. The board has already... Amelia cut him off, her voice loud and carrying, shattering the solemn silence of the room. She was no longer performing for his approval. She was fighting for her freedom. The board needs to see this. She strode to the head of the table, placing the printed email, the cold, smooth paper contrasting starkly with the polished wood, in front of the lead counsel, Mr. Thorne. Robert used the proprietary non-compete clause to freeze me out of the USA financial market, Amelia stated, her hands steady, displaying the non-compete agreement and the cease and desist letter. He claims the models are proprietary and exclusive to the firm. The shift from daughter to adversary was immediate, palpable, and intoxicating. She pointed to the printed email. Yet, here is his legal communication to the SEC regarding the Senator Davis deal, classifying those same models as standard, commercially available analytical tools. Which is it, Father? If they are proprietary, you committed securities fraud by misrepresentation to a public entity. If they are not proprietary, then your cease and desist is an illegal restraint of trade intended only to intimidate me into financial destitution. The room erupted in sharp, nervous murmurs. Mr. Thorne, the lead counsel, quickly scanned the documents, his face draining of color. The scent of ozone from the nearby power outlet seemed to crackle in the intense tension. Robert Harrington stood up, his chair scraping violently against the floor. But Amelia kept talking, holding the room's focus. I did not come here for the trust fund. I came to terminate the source of control. You can either immediately withdraw the cease and desist and pay out my share of the trust immediately, or I walk to the SEC with this. Robert Harrington's face was a mask of cold fury, but his eyes darted from Amelia to Mr. Thorne, seeking a lifeline that wasn't there. He was cornered not by integrity, but by the legal complexity of his own excessive control. Mr. Thorne cleared his throat, addressing Robert in a low, urgent tone. Sir, the risk of SEC scrutiny, given the public nature of the Davis deal in the USA market, it's significant. We must minimize exposure. The choice was impossible for Robert. Admit defeat publicly, or risk the collapse of his professional reputation through a fraud investigation. He chose the lesser public humiliation. Robert sank back into his chair, physically deflated. He nodded once, a barely perceptible tremor in his jaw. Terminate the injunction. Draft the settlement immediately. Her terms. Amelia won. She had secured the financial freedom she needed to protect Clara, not by compliance, but by confrontation. The exact thing her fear of disapproval had always prevented. She stood tall in the conference room, refusing to allow Robert the satisfaction of a prolonged silence. She scooped up the papers, nodded once at Thorne, and walked out, leaving the stunned board members in her wake. The texture of the expensive carpet under her feet felt like solid ground for the first time. The sound of her heels clicking firmly down the long marble hallway was the sound of a generational chain breaking. She didn't stop to gloat or to secure apologies. She drove directly back to her cramped apartment. Clara was waiting, coloring quietly. The conclusion was victory, but the cost of that victory was permanent and painful. She had severed the financial cord, but she had also severed the last fragile connection to her birth family. Robert would never speak to her again. Julian, who helped her, would be leaving the country. Clara looked up, her expression tentative. Mommy, are we okay? We are more than okay, sweetie. We are free, Amelia confirmed, pulling Clara into a tight hug. As she held her daughter, Amelia noticed a tiny white scar just above Clara's left eyebrow, a faint line from a fall last year. It was a permanent mark, just like the permanent loss Amelia had incurred, the definitive, final rejection of her father, and the definitive death of the small, fearful girl she used to be. The relief was overwhelming, but the scar of her fear of disapproval, the time she had wasted, the emotional suffering she had inflicted on Clara by waiting so long to fight, would remain.